I'm delighted, and I'm sure you are too, to have one of our best commentators on ADH, and that's Leith Van Onselen from macrobusiness.com.au. Leith is the unconventional economist, and Leith is going to begin this week with the thorny question of taxation reform. What's that all about, Leith?
Yeah, g'day, David. Thanks for having me on again. Look, the reason why I bring this topic up is that Australia has one of the most reliant tax systems on personal income taxes in the world. So Australia's tax system is unbelievably reliant on personal income taxes, and we don't collect enough taxes from other areas. And the reason why, and just to put some numbers around that, David, so according to last financial year, about 52% of federal government taxes came from personal income taxes. And that was projected in the last intergenerational report to grow to around 58% over the next several decades. Now, the reason why that's a problem is that effectively we're slugging a diminishing pool of workers. So because we've got an ageing population, the percentage of the population in work is falling over time, and it's projected to continue falling as the proportion of workers in the economy shrinks. And effectively what we're doing is we're taxing those people harder and harder every year through bracket creep, etc., to pay for taxes for everybody across the economy. Now, one of the reasons why our reliance on personal income taxes has grown so much is because the taxes that we raise from other areas, like the goods and services tax, fuel excise, tobacco excise, etc., they're all shrinking as a proportion of tax revenue. Now, the reason why the GST is shrinking in share is because the fastest growing areas of expenditure, i.e. health and education, are actually excluded from the GST. So what that means is that because those areas of expenditure are growing quickly, it means we're spending less relative on everything else. And that means that we're collecting less on the GST. So last financial year, we collect 13.4% of total taxation was from the GST. Now, that compares to a decade average of about 16%. So that's been shrinking. At the same time, excise revenue is shrinking because on the fuel excise side, we're obviously shifting towards more fuel-efficient vehicles, hybrids, electric vehicles, etc., which obviously we don't pay fuel excise on. So we're losing tax revenue there. And then on tobacco excise, for example, we're now taxing cigarettes at $2 a dart. People are smoking less, and also people are moving to the black market to buy the cigarettes because we're taxing it so highly, which means that we're collecting less tax. So effectively what Australia desperately needs is we need broad-based tax reform that shifts the burden away from from mostly taxing workers and taxing a diminishing pool of workers and taxing them more and more every year to spreading the burden across the economy. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel here, David. We could follow the Henry Tax Review's recommendations from 2010. They're mostly sound. It pretty much set the blueprint of what we should do to get rid of this reliance on personal income taxes. Although the thing that has changed since then, David, is we're obviously exporting massive amounts of gas, and we don't tax our resources. I've said every week we should be taxing our resources much more aggressively like they do in Norway and Qatar. And that would also allow the federal government to collect tax and also reduce taxes on personal income. So that's the fundamental reason why we need fundamental tax reform to shift the burden away from workers, because it's really unfair to be taxing a shrinking pool of workers more and more every year to fund goods, to fund services and infrastructure and everything on behalf of the whole economy. We need to spread the burden a bit better.
And add to that the problem of our federation, and that is, unlike any other federation in the world, the Commonwealth, the centre, takes 80% of the taxes. In most countries, most federations, it's between 30 and 40%. And when they take 80%, they then they dole out sums to the states, but then they tell the states how to spend it. Hence, you get the mess in areas of administration which should be running very well. For example, education. Education is a mess. We're producing a greater degree of those who are functionally illiterate or innumerate, something which never happened in the past. They've made a complete mess of it. Give it to Canberra, they'll waste it and make a mess of it. The whole thing is a complete mess. It needs a review. The problem is people don't trust the politicians. If the politicians say, we're going to reduce your tax, your personal tax, and we're going to increase the GST, they don't trust them to do that. They think they'll lie and increase both of them. The only way to control them is to have something like citizen-initiated referenda, where we can control the politicians when they step out of line. That's my view.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've got a constitutional problem here. So we have the three levels of government. Unfortunately, after the Second World War, when the states ceded the control of personal income taxes to the federal government, we have a system now, as you said, where the feds collect 80% of the tax revenue, just over 80%, and then we have this duplication of responsibilities in health, education, all those sorts of areas, which leads to inefficient outcomes and cost shifting and all those sorts of things. Unfortunately, to try and change that is next to impossible because we need a referendum, and referendums almost are impossible to pass, especially when it comes to things like taxation and levels of government, because you're always going to get the smaller states are always going to vote no, and you need the double majority of obviously a majority of voters and a majority of states. So unfortunately, we're stuck with the three levels of government that we've got, and we're stuck with the vertical fiscal imbalance whereby the feds collect 80% of their revenue. And that leads to a whole raft of inefficient outcomes, like you've just mentioned. I'll add that the biggest one of those is the mass immigration policy that the feds run. The feds run an extreme immigration policy because they get all the financial benefit from it. They collect all the extra personal income taxes, the company taxes, all goes to the federal government, yet the cost of that immigration goes to the states.
And that leads inevitably into the second problem that you're going to talk about today, and that is the collapse in that great Australian dream, home ownership, a complete collapse of the dream of all Australians, and they'll be wondering why they're living in such a paradise if they can't get their own homes.
Yeah, that's right. So the Intergenerational Report published a really good chart. Now, it was only up to the 2021 census, so it's already out of date, and things have gotten worse. But what it showed is that over the last 40 years, the proportion of Australians aged 25 to 29 that owned a home, which doesn't mean you've paid it off, it means you've purchased a home to live in, has fallen from 55% in 1981 down to 35% as of 2021. Now, that's a huge 20 basis point decline. But what it also showed is that the share of home ownership has actually fallen for subsequent age groups as well, all the way up to people who are at retirement age, where basically the home ownership rate hasn't changed. Now, the reason why the older cohorts, the home ownership rate hasn't fallen is because most of them bought their homes in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s before we had this massive boom in real estate values. And the problem with it is that if you fast forward 20 years and those people die off, we're going to basically have a situation whereby the home ownership rate would have fallen drastically across the board, across Australia. And this is all relates to the rise in house prices. And I'd argue that a lot of that rise in house prices has been driven by this excessive immigration.
And that leads to another of the problems you've listed, hasn't it? Because it's clear that there is a disincentive from the government on young people having children. We've got the lowest rate of reproduction in I think our history, and that's because young people can't get the houses they want to live in.
No, that's right. They're absolutely priced out. They're under obviously financial stress. They've had very poor income growth for 20 years, really almost zero income growth if you're a young person in real terms once you adjust for inflation. And at the same time as we're forcing younger people and future Australians into living in smaller high-rise apartments. So the whole system is built against having families. And the HSBC put out some research about a year ago, which basically said that for every I think it was for every 10% increase in house prices, the birth rate falls by a certain percentage, which is not none of this is rocket science. And I'd argue that high immigration is particularly bad for this, David, because if you're a first home buyer, you get hit twice by high levels of immigration. First, your rents go up because you have the obviously excess demand over supply, so it pushes up rents. That makes your cost of living higher, also means it's harder to save for a deposit. And secondly, higher immigration also directly increases the cost of housing, so it becomes more expensive to purchase. So you're hit with a double whammy. You can't save up a deposit because you're paying more in rent, and then the price of the actual dollar cost of housing also goes up, which makes it even harder to purchase. So we've got this situation whereby the home ownership rate's collapsing, especially amongst the younger Australians, and it's not going to turn around. And the on the flip side, our politicians have a home ownership rate of 95%, David.
Well, that's the good news, is it, Lee?
Yes, that's right. So while the broader Australian home ownership rate's about 66%, and that's skewed by the retirees who have a much higher home ownership rate, our politicians have a home ownership rate of 95%, and 2/3 of them own 2 or more properties.
So what does that graph, which is up now, what does that show?
So that shows that it shows the breakdown between our politicians. So 220 odd federal politicians and their home ownership status, and what it shows is that only 12 of our federal politicians out of 227, I think it is, don't own a property. 67 own 1 property, and 71 own 2 properties, and 77 own 2 or more properties. Three or more properties.
Yes. And we don't know who used negative gearing and who took advantage of the capital gains exemption in relation to that, do we?
Well, yeah. I mean, I suspect that anybody who owns an investment property, so that's basically 2/3 of our politicians, would be using negative gearing, and they'd also use a capital gains discount when they sell that property. So, one of them is our illustrious Prime Minister, who's got his investment property in Marrickville on the market for a couple $1 million. He's about to cash out and make a big profit on that, and he's actually used it to spend $4.3 million on a luxury beach house in the I think it's on the Central Coast.
Yes. Copacabana.
That's it, Copacabana. And to add insult to injury, David, it's just been revealed that he approved $100 million of taxpayers' money to improve the roads going into his new investment property. So there's a lot of political gaff going on here.
And what I also found really extraordinary was that to sell off his investment unit, he evicted the tenant. Now, another investor might have bought it. There was no need to evict the tenant. And then I looked at the proposed legislation, the recommended legislation by Labor in New South Wales. Labor's recommending legislation, and it has fair evictions. They're going to do away with landlords imposing unfair evictions. But one of the evictions allowed, curiously, is where you own an investment property and you want to sell it vacant possession. That's a specific exclusion in the New South Wales rules, which they're going to promulgate in the state for fair evictions. I find that it's almost as surprising as paying for that road, which is going to allow the Prime Minister to drive to this place.
And no doubt increase the value of that property, because if you improve the transport link to the property that you've just purchased, well then obviously, it's going to increase its amenity, it's going to increase its value. So look, I mean, it's the whole thing stinks. It really does. At the same time as, I don't want to be one of these people who's got tall poppy syndrome who wants to attack anyone who gets wealthy or whatever, but he's a politician, right? He's been a politician his entire life. Let's not pretend that he's done anything particularly useful other than be a politician. And
if I can interrupt you, there was an opinion poll on that. People asked, what has the Prime Minister done good for you? And a large number of people couldn't name anything that the Prime Minister had done good for them.
No, that's right. And he just traded up the property ladder and et cetera, used, and bought himself this absolute luxury beach top property. And then it turns out that earlier in the year, or maybe it was last year, He approved, huge amount of taxpayer money to improve the transport links to the property that he's just recently bought, which the whole thing just really stinks, to be quite frank.
But the good news that you have this week, is it not that in construction, the number of tradies has been reduced, the proportion of tradies has been reduced, and they've increased the number of men and women in suits in the construction industry. Do you think that's a good thing?
Look, it's farcical. So, I mean, it is a bit of a head scratcher that we constantly hear that Australia's construction industry doesn't have enough workers, etc. But when you actually break it down, right? So, if you look at those listed as working in construction, we actually have one of the highest shares in the world, right? So, Australia, 5.2% of our workforce, 5.2% of our total population works in construction, which is well above the OECD average of 3.3%. So on the face of it, you think we've got enough construction people, but then the data's come out, and this comes from independent economist Tarek Brooker, who crunched the numbers. And in the last 20 years, we've had about just over a 40% increase in the number of labourers, tradies, a nearly 50% increase in the number of labourers over 20 years. But here's the thing, David, the number of consultants working in construction industry has risen by over 150%. And we've also had an increase in building technicians, which is another, bureaucratic type role, has increased by about 80% over the last 2 years. So, yes, we do have a lot of people working in the construction industry, but they're not frontline workers who actually build the stuff. We've just had this massive blowout in suits, bureaucrats and effectively private sector bureaucrats, administrators, all that sort of thing. They don't actually build anything. They're just basically paper shufflers. And I'd argue that this is endemic of the Australian economy. We've had a massive blowout in public sector bureaucrats at the state and federal level. I'm not talking about nurses and teachers and police. They're the people who do the real work. We've had a massive blowout in, back office bureaucrats. And we've seen it across all our public companies as well now. So, it doesn't matter if you're an energy company or you're a bank or whatever. Just massive blowout in bureaucrats across the whole private sector. Across universities now, we've got massive amounts of administrators, not that many actual teachers anymore, and people doing the lectures. It's all, the blowouts have all been in the administration level, and now we're seeing it in construction as well. So this is kind of one of the reasons why Australia's productivity is so poor, and why in this particular case, our construction productivity is so poor, because we don't actually have tradies. We haven't increased the number of tradies significantly, or the number of labourers. We've increased the number of consultants and, people in suits who don't actually do the work. And this is Australia's fundamental problem.
One of the concerns in this state is obviously the sex of those who work in the building industry, which I'm sure you lie awake at night worrying about. Now, what they've done, I notice when I drive past building sites around Bondi, and there are a lot of building sites around Bondi, they're always attractive young ladies who direct the traffic. And this is because the local politicians in New South Wales were very much concerned about how dominated the building industry was by males. So they've made sure that there are females in the building industry. Strangely, where I live, when the garbage is collected, I find that all of the garbage men are men. Strangely, there's no requirement in Waverley for garbage men to sometimes be garbage women, and I find that extraordinary.
Yeah, the whole thing is just a bit of a joke. I mean, nobody's sitting there doing a campaign trying to get more men to be nurses, etc. Like, this is just the way it is. There's certain professions are dominated by men, some are dominated by women, whatever, who cares? But we're seeing the same madness in Victoria, David, whereby the Victorian government has literally, it's undertaken to this boondoggle of a railway project called the Suburban Rail Loop. It's the biggest financial black hole I think Australia has ever seen. It's basically a railway to nowhere across the middle of Melbourne, which nobody asked for. It's going to cost, once the 3 stages are built, about $200 billion, right? It's ridiculous. But instead of focusing on the cost and, all the issues surrounding the project, it's very controversial. The Victorian government released an ad saying that, the Suburban Rail Loop is going to have the world's first female-only tunnel drilling team. Like, who cares? Like,
exactly.
Nobody
Who cares?
Nobody cares. Nobody cares what the gender is of the people who build this stuff or whatever. We just want things to be done efficiently and and well. But because of all this virtue signalling and wokeness that's crept into everything, we've got all these side issues while the actual efficiency of these projects plummets and the nation's productivity collapses. It's madness.
Lee, thank you once again. You brought all of these important things to us, which we should know about. We should know what our politicians are up to and the messes they're creating. Once again, thank you so much. And people can always get your newsletter, can't they, from macrobusiness.com.au. Thank you, Leith, and I hope you'll be available again to tell us the truth, the unconventionally revealed truth in relation to the Australian economy and politics.
Thanks, David. Speak to you next time.
Good.